The brass letter opener trembled in my grip. Cold, heavy, real. My mother's phone lit up with the truth. Chloe's father had set me up. The security guard lunged, his fist aimed for my face, but I barely saw him. The numbers on that spreadsheet burned brighter than the wedding candles outside. 15 seconds. That's all I had before the door burst open and my life collapsed. Sign the note or lose everything. The ink was still wet. My hands weren't. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax clung to the bridal suite, thick enough to coat Michael's tongue. He tugged at his silk collar, the starch scraping his neck like a dull blade. Across the velvet chaise, Eleanor stood rigid. She didn't offer a mother's blessing. Instead, she slid a crisp, multi-page document across the mahogany desk. The paper crackled in the silence of the room, a sharp, dry sound that seemed to echo off the marble walls. Michael traced the columns of figures. Braces, private tutoring. A decade of equestrian lessons he never requested. The ink looked fresh, pulsating against the cream-colored bond. At the bottom, a bold sum of $150,000 stared up at him, a cold tally of his existence. It wasn't just a number. It was a ransom note for his own life. "Sign it, Michael," Eleanor said. Her voice carried the dry rasp of a desert wind, devoid of the warmth one might expect on a wedding morning. "Consider it a down payment on your independence." He gripped the silver fountain pen. The cool metal bit into his palm, a grounding sensation against the rising tide of nausea. Outside the heavy oak doors, the muffled quartet played a frantic Vivaldi, the violins screeching like distant sirens, but inside, the air remained stagnant. Eleanor smoothed her lace skirts, her eyes tracking his every twitch. She didn't blink. She waited for the scratch of the nib, the sound of his future snapping into her palm. "I thought this was a wedding gift," Michael whispered, his voice catching on the thick floral air. Eleanor leaned forward, her perfume, something sharp and metallic, like ozone before a storm, overwhelming the lilies. "There are no gifts in this family, only investments. You're about to marry into the Millers. I won't have you forgetting who built the foundation you're standing on." His hand shook. The promissory note felt heavier than the wedding ring tucked in his pocket. He pressed the pen to the signature line, the blue ink bleeding into the paper like a bruise. He felt the weight of her gaze, a physical pressure on the back of his neck. This was her way of ensuring he never truly left, that even as he stood at the altar, he was still her property, a line item in her meticulously maintained ledger. The door handle rattled, a sudden, sharp intrusion into the suffocating atmosphere. David Miller, Michael's best man and closest friend since their days at Yale, burst into the room. His face was flushed, his tie slightly askew, radiating a frantic energy that clashed with the room's grim stillness. "Michael? The guests are—" David stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting between Michael's pale face and the document on the desk. He took in the tension, the way Eleanor stood like a predator over her kill. "Is everything okay in here? Sarah's losing her mind out there. The quartet is on their third loop of spring." Eleanor didn't turn around. She simply raised a hand, a silent command for silence. But the shadow by the door moved. Robert Cook, the man Eleanor had hired as event security, though he looked more like a debt collector in a suit 2 sizes too small, stepped forward. He was a wall of muscle, his neck thicker than Michael's thigh. As David took another step into the room, Robert's hand shot out, a blur of dark fabric and brute force. He shoved David back against the mahogany desk. The impact was a sickening thud of bone against wood. A crystal vase of white roses teetered and crashed to the floor, water soaking into the Persian rug with a heavy, wet sound. David gasped, his breath hitching as he struggled to regain his footing, his hands scrambling against the polished surface. "Stay back," Robert rumbled. The sound didn't come from his throat. It vibrated out of his chest, like the low hum of a failing transformer. He stepped into the space between David and the desk, his presence a physical barrier that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Michael felt a surge of white-hot adrenaline. The coin in his pocket, the silver one he flipped to make sense of the world, clinked against his thigh as he moved. He didn't think. He reacted. This was David, the only person who hadn't asked him for a percentage or a payout in a decade. Subverted, Michael lunged. He wasn't a fighter, but he was fast, his body lean and fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage. He threw his weight into Robert's side, the man's suit jacket feeling like rough canvas against his shoulder. It was a logical move. Use the element of surprise to off-balance the larger man, create enough of a distraction for David to get clear. Michael's mind raced with the cold efficiency of a trader. If he could pin the arm, he could neutralize the reach. He grappled with Robert, his fingers digging into the thick muscle of the guard's forearm. He felt a moment of triumph as Robert stumbled back, his heavy boots scuffing the hardwood. Michael managed to twist the man's arm behind his back, a move he'd seen 1,000 times in films, and for a heartbeat, it actually worked. Robert groaned, his face contorting. Michael reached out, his hand closing around the heavy brass letter opener on the desk, a sharp, weighted spike of metal. He held it up, the tip glinting under the chandelier. "Back off," Michael shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. "Both of you, get away from him." He felt a surge of protective pride. He had done it. He had stepped up, defended his friend, and seized control of the room. He looked at David, expecting to see gratitude, a shared look of, "We're getting out of this." He saw David straightening his jacket, his hands smoothing the lapels with a strange, methodical calm. The relief Michael felt was a warm wave, a brief moment of clarity. He had the weapon, he had the position, and he had his ally. The crisis was peaking, but he was winning. He could feel Robert's muscles relax under his grip, the guard seemingly yielding to the threat of the brass spike. But then, the crack appeared. Michael noticed the way David wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Eleanor. And Eleanor wasn't afraid. She wasn't even looking at the letter opener. She was looking at David with an expression of mild, maternal boredom. "David," Michael said, his grip on the guard's arm loosening just a fraction. "Are you okay?" David didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, white handkerchief, wiping a smudge of dust from his sleeve. He didn't look like a man who had just been assaulted. He looked like a man waiting for a cue. The truth hit Michael like a physical blow to the stomach. The shove hadn't been an attack. It had been a transition, a piece of theater designed to draw Michael into a physical confrontation, to make him the aggressor, to put a weapon in his hand in front of witnesses. Robert didn't struggle anymore. He simply turned, his massive hand closing around Michael's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. The brass letter opener clattered to the floor. "Thank you, Robert," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk. "And thank you, David. I think that's more than enough evidence of Michael's unstable state of mind should we need to discuss his fitness for the merger." David finally looked at Michael. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by the flat, empty stare of a man who had already cashed the check. "Sorry, Mike," he whispered, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "The market's shifting. I had to hedge my bets. Michael felt the world tilt. His best friend hadn't stumbled into a trap. He had set it. The very person he had risked his safety to protect was the one who had handed the leash to his mother. The room, once a bridal suite, now felt like a high-security cell where the guards and the inmates had traded places. In the stunned silence that followed David's betrayal, Michael's eyes fell on his mother's designer handbag, perched on the edge of the chaise like a resting predator. The clasp was slightly ajar. Without thinking, fueled by a desperate animal instinct to find some kind of leverage, he lunged. Robert was momentarily distracted by David's movement, and Michael's fingers brushed the cold, smooth glass of Eleanor's phone. He snatched it, retreating to the far corner of the room, his back against the bolted window. "Give that back, Michael," Eleanor snapped, her composure finally fracturing. A red flush crept up her neck, clashing with her silver hair. "That is private property." Michael didn't listen. His thumb swiped across the screen. It wasn't locked. Eleanor's arrogance was her one weakness. She never imagined anyone would dare touch her things. He scrolled through the most recent messages, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The texts were encrypted, but the names weren't. Vanderbilt, Chloe's father. "The target is vulnerable," one message read. "He's overextended on the tech merger. Use the upbringing ledger as the primary pressure point. If he doesn't sign, we pull the Vanderbilt funding and let the sharks have him." Michael felt a cold shiver dance down his spine. This wasn't just a mother trying to claw back money from a successful son. This was a coordinated strike. William Vanderbilt, the man whose daughter he was about to marry, was conspiring with Eleanor to break him. They didn't want a son-in-law. They wanted a puppet. They were using his own history, his own childhood, as a garrote. "You're working with him," Michael said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You're selling me to the Vanderbilts like a piece of distressed debt." Eleanor straightened her back, her eyes narrowing. "I am securing our future, Michael. William understands the value of legacy. You're too busy playing at being a self-made man to see that you're drowning. We're just throwing you a rope. It's not our fault if the rope has a price." A frantic pounding started on the heavy oak door. "Michael? Eleanor? We're 10 minutes past the start time." It was Sarah Jenkins, the wedding coordinator. Her voice was high-pitched, vibrating with the kind of crystalline panic that only comes from a woman whose career depended on a schedule. "The string quartet is playing the processional. The guests are staring at the empty aisle. Is everything all right?" Michael looked at the door, then at the phone, then at the 3 people standing between him and his life. "Tell her Chloe's dress ripped," Michael shouted, his mind racing to buy seconds. "The zipper snapped. We need 10 minutes. "A dress malfunction?" Sarah's voice dropped an octave, filled with professional dread. "Oh, God. I'll send the seamstress. I'll tell the quartet to play the Bach." The sound of her scurrying footsteps faded, but the silence that replaced it was heavier. Eleanor checked her watch, a small platinum piece that ticked with a relentless, mechanical precision. "You have 20 minutes, Michael," she said, her voice regaining its icy calm. "I've already prepared a digital copy of your debt ledger and the records of your creative accounting at the firm. I have a contact at the Chronicle. One press of a button, and the world knows that Michael Sterling, the golden boy of venture capital, is a fraud and a deadbeat. Your reputation will be a smoking crater before you even reach the altar." Michael felt the walls closing in. He looked at the window, but the heavy iron bolts were visible even through the sheer curtains. Robert had been busy. The room was a pressurized cage. He paced the narrow strip of carpet between the bed and the desk, his boots silent on the silk. He noticed the floral arrangements. Towering displays of lilies and hydrangeas had been shifted. They weren't just decor. They were positioned to block the secondary service door. Robert moved toward him, the fire extinguisher from the wall bracket now in his hand. He didn't use it as a tool. He held it like a club. "Enough games," Robert grunted. Michael dived. He used the mahogany desk as a shield, sliding across the polished surface as Robert swung the heavy red canister. The metal whistled through the air, smashing into a porcelain lamp with a sound like a gunshot. Shards of white ceramic sprayed across the room. Michael scrambled toward the walk-in closet, his heart thundering. The air in the suite was hot, smelling of scorched dust and broken electronics. He reached the closet door, a heavy slab of mirrored wood, and ducked inside. Robert followed, his heavy footsteps vibrating through the floor. The closet was a narrow tunnel of empty designer suits, the fabric brushing against Michael's face like the ghosts of men who had already been consumed by this family. "Come out, kid," Robert's voice echoed in the small space. Michael waited behind a rack of tuxedos. As Robert stepped past, his shadow long and distorted on the white carpet, Michael lunged out. He didn't go for the man. He went for the door. He slammed it shut, the heavy wood clicking into the frame and through the external bolt. Robert roared, a sound of pure, animal frustration, followed by the heavy thud, thud, thud of his fists against the door. The mirror on the front of the closet cracked, a spiderweb of silver lines spreading across the surface. Michael leaned against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had neutralized the physical threat, but the clock was still ticking. He walked back to the mahogany desk, his eyes falling on the leather folder Eleanor had presented. He opened it again, but this time he didn't look at the upbringing costs. He looked at the supporting documents tucked into the back pocket. His blood ran cold. These weren't just receipts for writing lessons. They were internal trade logs from his firm, private, encrypted data that should have been impossible to access. He saw his own handwritten notes on the margins of a deal for a biotech startup. Notes that discussed the risk of failure in terms that could easily be twisted into intent to defraud. He recognized the handwriting on the sticky notes attached to the logs. It wasn't his mother's sharp, angular script. It was loopy, casual, and utterly familiar. David. Michael looked at his best man, who was still standing by the window, calmly checking his nails. "You didn't just leak the debt, David. You gave her the keys to my servers." David shrugged, a small, pathetic movement of his shoulders. "You were always too focused on the big picture, Mike. You forgot that the small details, the passwords, the access codes, are what actually run the world. Eleanor offered me a seat at the table. All I had to do was provide the menu." The betrayal felt like a serrated blade twisting in Michael's chest. Every late-night strategy session, every drink shared after a hard-won deal, it had all been a long con. David wasn't his brother. He was a corporate spy with a front-row seat to Michael's life. Michael felt a sudden, frantic need to strike back. He grabbed David's jacket, which had been tossed onto the chaise during the earlier scuffle. He felt something hard and rectangular in the inner pocket. A flash drive. "What's this?" Michael demanded, pulling it out. David's face went pale, his calculated calm finally shattering. "Give that back. That's personal." "Nothing is personal anymore," Michael spat. He lunged for the laptop on the desk, his fingers flying across the keys. He didn't need a password. The system was already logged into the house network. "This is it, isn't it?" Michael said, a desperate hope flaring in his chest. Your insurance policy. The files on Eleanor's offshore accounts. You wouldn't just work for her without having a way to burn her if things went south. He looked at his mother. Her eyes were wide, her hand reaching out as if to physically stop the data from moving. Michael, don't. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Michael said, his voice trembling with a mix of terror and triumph. I'm sending this to the IRS. I'm sending it to the SEC. If I'm going down, I'm taking the whole Sterling legacy with me. Eleanor lunged at him, her manicured nails clawing at his wrists. They grappled over the laptop, the screen flickering as the device slid across the mahogany. Michael shoved her back, his breath coming in jagged sobs. Stay away from me, he screamed. Outside, Sarah Jenkins was wailing. The Vanderbilts are at the door. They want to know why the groom isn't at the altar. Michael, please. Subverted. Michael ignored her. He focused on the screen. He saw a folder labeled Sterling_assets_offshore. This was it. The silver bullet. The evidence of tax evasion that would strip Eleanor of her power and her freedom. He clicked upload and selected his entire contact list. The board, the press, the authorities. This is for the riding lessons, he whispered. He hit enter. A small green progress bar appeared. Uploading. 10%, 20%. Michael felt a massive weight lift from his shoulders. He had done it. He had outplayed them. He had used their own greed against them. He looked at Eleanor, expecting to see defeat. Instead, she started to laugh. It was a low, chilling sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. You really are my son, Michael, she said, her voice dripping with a terrifying kind of pity. You always think you've found the shortcut. Michael looked back at the screen. The progress bar had turned red. Critical system failure. The screen flashed. A series of windows began to pop up, too fast to read. Lines of code, not his, not the firm's, began to scroll across the display. What is this? Michael gasped. It's a kill switch, Michael, David said. His voice regained its steady, mocking tone. I didn't keep evidence of her crimes on that drive. I kept the virus she bought to wipe yours. The truth hit Michael like a physical blow. The flash drive wasn't a weapon. It was a Trojan horse. By plugging it into the network and attempting to broadcast the evidence, Michael had triggered a program that was now systematically dismantling his digital existence. He watched, helpless, as his personal bank accounts were emptied. His professional credentials, the digital keys to his firm, were being revoked in real time. The software was replacing his legitimate records with forged data, making it look like he had been funneling company funds into private accounts for years. Access denied. The screen screamed in bold, red letters. Credentials revoked. Michael lunged for the keyboard, his fingers frantic, but the keys were dead. The laptop shrieked, a high-pitched electronic wail that vibrated through the desk and into his bones. The air smelled of scorched silicon. You're framing me, Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the electronic scream. We're not framing you, darling, Eleanor said, stepping forward to smooth his lapel. We're simply reallocating your assets. You wanted to be independent. Now you are. You have nothing. No money, no firm, no reputation. You have only us. Michael felt his knees buckle. He had tried to be smart, tried to play the game, and he had handed them the very match they needed to burn his world down. He was standing in a room full of people who had spent his entire life calculating his value, and the ledger had finally hit zero. The music outside reached a crescendo, the final, triumphant notes of the processional. The heavy oak doors were thrown open, and Sarah Jenkins stood there, flanked by two of William Vanderbilt's personal bodyguards. "It's time," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "The world is waiting." Michael was led out of the suite like a prisoner to the gallows. His legs felt like lead, his mind a chaotic whirl of red numbers and broken promises. He walked through the gallery of Vanderbilt ancestors, their blue eyes judging him from the shadows. He reached the altar. The garden was a sea of white silk and expectant faces. The elite of Greenwich, the people who decided who mattered and who was discarded. At the front, William Vanderbilt stood like a mountain, his gold signet ring tapping rhythmically against the wooden pew. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of a hammer on a coffin. Michael looked at Chloe. She stood in her cage of lace, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the exit. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not a bride, but a fellow captive. The minister began to speak, the words a drone of tradition and contract. Michael felt the weight of the microphone in his hand. He was supposed to say, "I do." He was supposed to sign the final document that would bind his ruined life to the Vanderbilt machine. But as he looked at Eleanor, sitting in the front row with a triumphant smile, something snapped. The silver coin in his pocket felt cold against his leg. He didn't say the vows. He raised the microphone. "Before we begin," Michael's voice boomed through the speakers, amplified and raw. "I think everyone should know the cost of this union, not the emotional cost, the literal one." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of confusion and growing scandal. Eleanor's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Michael pulled the crumpled, itemized cost of upbringing from his pocket. $150,000, he read, his voice steadying with every word. "That's what my mother believes I owe her for the privilege of being raised. $12,000 for private tutoring, $5,000 for summer camps I hated, $3,000 for a dental bill from 1998. He looked at the shocked faces of the donors, the investors, the socialites. "This isn't a wedding. It's a liquidation sale, and I've decided to default on the loan." He turned to William Vanderbilt. "And as for the merger, you should check your email, William. I sent the board a little gift before my accounts were wiped. A detailed map of how you and my mother plan to use the Vanderbilt assets to cover her private debts. I believe the term is collusion." The garden erupted. People stood, shouting, whispering, the carefully manicured piece of the estate shattering like glass. William Vanderbilt lunged forward, his face a mask of purple rage. But his own bodyguards stepped into his path, their phones already buzzing with frantic calls from the board. Michael looked at Chloe. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The cage is open." Chloe looked at her father, then at the screaming crowd, and finally at Michael. She didn't run for the exit. She stepped toward him, her hand closing around his. "I've always hated red," she said, her voice clear and strong for the first time. "And I've always hated this house." Together, they turned away from the altar. They walked past the row of stunned guests, past Eleanor, who sat frozen in her seat, a queen whose kingdom had just turned to ash. They walked through the limestone halls, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the marble. They reached the iron gates. The black pikes curved inward, but the electronic lock was dead. The virus Michael had triggered had taken out the estate's security system along with his bank accounts. Michael pushed the heavy gates open. They emitted a long, metallic screech that sounded like a cry of liberation. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the lavender-scented air of Greenwich finally feeling thin and clean. He had no money. He had no career. His name was a scandal that would be discussed at every cocktail party for a decade. But as he felt the weight of Eleanor's ledger finally lift from his shoulders, Michael Sterling realized he had finally found something that didn't have a price tag. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver coin. He didn't flip it. He simply let it drop into the gutter, where it vanished with a small, final clink. He didn't need to check the math anymore. For the first time in his life, the balance was zero, and zero felt like everything.